This episode, I'm joined by Victoria Walker to discuss the life and work of writer Anna Kavan, primarily from Walker's book, Anna Kavan, Mid-Century Experimental Fiction. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying subscribers and patrons for making all of this work possible. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Victoria Walker, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
We are going to be discussing the work of Anna Kavan, primarily taking inspiration from your book that was published in 2023 by Edinburgh University Press, which is Anna Kavan, Mid-Century Experimental Fiction, which is, from what I was reading about it, it's sort of heralded as the first critical, book-length critical study of Kavan's experimental fiction. So I guess other than those people who are very into what we broadly class as obscure fiction, and then Kavan is like, well, do you put her in science fiction, experimental fiction, whereabouts do you put her? Most people would know Kavan for Ice now, which is now in a Penguin, a very nice minimalist Penguin edition, but there's a whole other world of beautiful Kavan literature out there, which we're going to be discussing. So yeah, before we jump in, just Victoria, tell us a little bit about yourself. The origin of this book, and then also you played a big role in the Anna Kavan Society, I believe, as well. Also,
Yeah, so I started working on Kavan when I decided to write a PhD on her, and there was very, very little academic work that had already been done on her at that point. It was really almost impossible to find someone academic who'd even heard of her. That's how obscure her writing was at that moment in time, which I guess was sort of early 2010s. So that has changed quite a lot, I think, in the last 15 or so years. So the book really is the culmination of my PhD research, which was just on Anna Kavan. So it was a single author PhD. The first one that was done outside of New Zealand. There had been somebody else who'd done a study of her work in New Zealand. And so that's me, really. Anna Kavan is my speciality. I think the book moved on from my PhD research in that I was very much trying to situate her somewhere within the context of the writing of her times. So hence the focus on the mid-century and the focus on experimental writing.
so where did it all begin for you with Kavan? Was it a case that you're searching for someone for your PhD, or did you have an original love for her writing before that?
Yeah, no, I was very specifically looking to write a PhD on women's writing and especially representations of psychiatric treatment. And I was looking for somebody obscure. So if you want some obscure women's writing on psychiatric treatment from the 20th century, it's not hard to find. I had an absolute stack of books that I was working my way through. And I picked up Kavan's Asylum piece, which was published in 1940. And as soon as I started reading it, I knew that she was the thing that I wanted to dig into. There was something so striking to me about her writing, about that book in particular. And so that was it. That was the catch.
That's probably my favorite, and it doesn't really have any answers at all. Especially terrible for memorizing the sections, but the section on is it an enemy? When just a sort of section of open paranoia about being, I mean, that's an absolutely fascinating piece and probably my favorite thing by her. So thinking back, was there anything that stuck out for Kavan that differed from the other authors in the stack at that point that you thought was perhaps key to what you were writing?
Yeah, I think just the style of her writing, this sort of the very unusual style of her writing, it was doing something really that I felt I hadn't read before. And that really was what struck me, I think. And it's interesting when we talk about her work, like reading other people's assessments of her work, she's very often described as being unique. And there are sort of good and bad things about that, I think, because if we describe her as being really unique, and a sort of a writer sort of disengaged from any other writing, it misses out a lot. You fail to see the connections between her writing and what other people are doing. You fail to see her as part of a literary lineage in a way, whereas actually so much of what she's doing you can see in other writers of her time. So it's hard to avoid that, those expressions of uniqueness, because it does seem sometimes that there's something so distinctive about her writing, especially in something like A Silent Piece. But then it's difficult calling her unique. I think in the book, what I was trying to do was very much say she isn't, on her own.
Okay.
She is very networked, or her writing is very networked. It's very exemplative of other things that were going on in the mid-century in fictional writing.
Yeah, I think at one point in your book you state, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Kafka's The Trial was basically Kavan's Bible.
Yes, that was certain people who knew her described it as thus. And you see references to it cropping up in her fiction as well as in her correspondence. So there are strong correlations between her work and Kafka's, but other people's writing as well. She's very often very explicitly engaging with other writers. Ice, for example, you mentioned obviously her best known work. There was a piece published a few years ago now, which shows that she's actually in dialogue with Alan Burns's novel Europe After the Rain. Like it's very clear that she's writing back to that novel. It's not just a sort of an odd allusion. So there are other moments in her work where she's really, really strongly engaging with other writers, and I think we have to acknowledge that. When we're reading her work, rather than just thinking, oh, she's doing something that nobody else is doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess what kind of genre would she usually be placed in within that lineage, or is that a impossible question?
I think that is an impossible one, and I think that's why there wasn't much study done on her for a long time, because obviously she's publishing between 1929 and 1967. So, and because she's an experimental writer, she's doing different things at different moments in her career. So to put one label on her, to say she's doing one thing across that entire career, is very difficult. Ice, obviously, you can clearly call it science fiction. And some of her short stories, some of her latest short stories especially, you could call science fiction, but you couldn't call her earlier realist writing science fiction. And she dots around, she goes back to a more realist style later in her career. She's doing different things at different points, and that's why it's really hard to call her anything but experimental, because she is constantly, and I think she was very consciously doing that, trying out new things. Like she didn't want to just keep doing the same thing. Again, her correspondence shows that. Sort of later in her life, her publisher is sort of going, could you give me something that's a bit like this other thing that did well? And she's like, no, I can't keep writing the same way my whole life. So she's and she calls herself experimental. So for me, that's the word that works. It's very broad, but it works for her. That's the best categorization I can find.
Yeah, I mean, just jumping back to Ice and calling it science fiction, if you put it amidst, I don't know, I'm sure maybe you have different thoughts on this, but if you put it amidst 10 other novels that were in the category of science fiction, you'd pick it up and think, this isn't real. I didn't expect this at all. I restarted that novel about 4 times before I finally got through it, because it's just like, well, there's nothing. I mean, and this is probably going to be the difficulty of the whole conversation, because in the writing and Kavan's own life, there's like, and in your own book, and I mean this in a nice way, there's like nothing to hold on to at any point. As soon as something's sort of built, it just breaks away, both biographically and in the fiction. And so this next question, which is really, how would you describe her writing, is, I'll hand that over to you, because I've no idea. So like the only way I could describe it is maybe in the negative.
Yeah. Well, I think what you were just saying, maybe paradoxical is one word, which works. It's one thing and it's another at the same time. I think that's not a bad way to do it. But to give people that don't know it a flavor of it, I think it's worth saying it's generally quite dark. It's sometimes unsettling or sort of destabilizing. I think people who love her writing are the type of person who likes to feel quite challenged by reading fiction. They like to sort of be kept on their toes. It's a sort of shifting thing, her writing. But again, it's variable. If you read some of her early work, it's a very different experience from reading Ice, for example. So, yeah, I feel like that was a non-answer to you.
No, it's probably the only answer. But I guess talking about the early work, we should mention, I get this because the biographical details are at one and the same time again a paradox. These very clear moments or very clear biographical scenes, we could say, of what we would now understand as heroin addiction and controlling marriages and not really knowing a very fragmented personality. But when you sort of look into the minutiae of her life, it's far more fluxing and not as clear cut. But there is this one split that I guess needs to be mentioned in that we are talking about Anna Kavan, but originally she wasn't Anna Kavan. She was Helen Ferguson, who was also a writer, who then Anna Kavan, there's like a midpoint where Anna Kavan becomes a fictional entity and then becomes real.
Yep.
And
Yes.
it's less
Yeah.
complicated than I've made it seem there.
Yeah. So she begins to publish under her married name, which is Helen Ferguson, in 1929, and she publishes 6 novels, and they're all fairly realist in style, sort of third-person writing, sort of melodrama in a way. Some of it is quite autobiographically inflected, 2 novels especially, and the protagonist of those more autobiographical novels is called Anna Kavan. So Anna Kavan starts out as Helen Ferguson's fictional character. It isn't until 1939 that she then starts to publish under the name Anna Kavan and writes an incredibly different style. It's a set of short stories. She's writing in the first person for the first time. Her writing becomes non-realist, very sparse, very stripped back. There's not really much in the way of plot. There's not much in the way of characterization. Sometimes you really don't know who is talking and where they are. That book is a silent piece. And so it's a book that really is touching on the experience of mental breakdown and the experience of psychiatric treatment, although where those two things differ and intersect is sometimes hard to understand. So that's when, I was saying her writing becomes sort of hard work on the reader. You have to sort of really navigate your way through those stories. So that's her first book as Anna Kavan. It becomes really quite successful. She's, despite the 6 novels, the earlier 6 novels, they didn't do great. They were sort of variably reviewed, but A Silent Piece was her big break. And following that, she decides to take the name Anna Kavan as her own. So Anna Kavan begins as her fictional character, becomes her pen name, and then becomes her own identity. Does that cover it?
It does cover it, but I guess it's a bit of an abstract question. So what is Anna Kavan then? What do you think that remains for Anna Kavan, the real person throughout the end? As it's a fictional identity, do you think she needed that as like a safe haven or something to work with or something along those lines?
I think from reading her correspondence, which I've spent a lot of time in, I think the most important thing for her was herself as a writer. Her success as a writer was something that she held on very tightly to, and was incredibly important to her. She didn't want to compromise. As I was saying earlier, she didn't want to just produce something that publishers were asking her for. She believed very deeply in herself as a writer. And I think that name for her, that was the association, and that's why she took it in her personal life. She says that around the time when she's making the change from Helen Ferguson to Anna Kavan, she says, I want to get away from, this is a letter to her lover, I want to get away from Helen Ferguson and all her associations. So things had not gone so well for her in her life as Helen Ferguson. She'd had 2 disastrous marriages. She'd ended up in an asylum. She'd had suicide attempts. By that point in her life, she was already addicted to heroin. So things weren't great as Helen Ferguson, but what Anna Kavan was a successful writer. And I think that, to me, it seems, is why she claimed that identity.
Okay. Does she ever write anywhere, or is there any correspondence about, what writing is to her, or maybe even why she began?
She talks about starting, and certainly I think she'd been writing for quite a while before she was published. But I do think, again, like these things moved throughout her life. She was writing for such a long time. Um, so I'm not sure that I could sort of say much about the origins of her writing. As I said, she talks about her own experimental writing. She talks in her journalism about what she thinks fiction should do. That's an interesting thing to read. She's mostly talking about other writers, but you can read between the lines there about what it is she's trying to achieve with her writing. So I think she had a very strong belief in fiction as being something that is not escapism.
Mm-hmm.
That's not why we should read fiction, that it's something that is doing work, that is challenging the reader and responding to its political moment, actually.
Well, she certainly succeeded, because I didn't want to get away from a book more than ice, which is, I guess, a compliment, but it's such a suffocating.
Yeah.
Well, most of her work is suffocating. So what? It's all so slippery and fragmented. What threads do you see that are recurrent throughout her work? Because we always have these, not always, but there's these themes that seem to interlock. So often the protagonists are vulnerable, pretty young, often pale women. There's also, her relationship to dominative institutions such as the psychiatric institutions, and also marriage. And then the sort of loss and alienation of the self. But is there other threads? Is a central thread really alienation and just not knowing what one is at all?
Yeah, I'd say that. I mean, if you wanted to try and find one thing that that is a really good one. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you've touched on the sort of that recurring character, which is slightly different to a theme, isn't it? But we can't deny it's there.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, this character, which is a character, it's not the same character. I would really push back against readings that think she's writing the same character the whole time, but very frequently her characters don't have names, and so there will be a character that in some instances is referred to as the girl, and as you say, is a very sort of young but sort of vulnerable, possibly sort of psychologically damaged, physically frail character. So that's one character that sort of does seem to echo, or it's a trope that echoes throughout her writing. Madness, I would say, even in her early realist writings, that's there in almost every book. So she's already really interested in that, even before it becomes really the central theme of her 1940s writing. So that crops up a lot. And yeah, as you say, just the sort of like the unknowableness of identity. And also, I think, a sort of a real pushback against the idea of objective reality. So again, in her early works, that's there already, but not in a sort of, it's more in, you see her describing characters who are experiencing feelings of unreality. Mm-hmm. Later, when she starts writing the first person, you the reader become sort of sucked into that, where you're sort of grappling to figure out what's going on with reality. So I think that's one thing that I would also say is a theme, that constant pushback against the idea that we can know what the real is. And again, like that when it comes to my book, was something that I really began to notice was a shift in mid-century writing generally. Kavan makes it very explicit, but I think other writers are also sort of undermining objective reality, very much so in the mid-century.
What other writers are you thinking of when you say that?
Well, I mean, so many. Anyone who you might describe as being experimental. Mm-hmm. So anyone who's doing something other than like straight realism, and even writers who you think are doing straight realism, like things kind of start to get a bit weird. I guess the writers I look at her against very explicitly are Jean Rhys. I think there's huge overlap with Rhys. I know that Kavan was a big fan of Jean Rhys's writing, and Rhys read Kavan, so sort of not surprising in a way. They liked each other's work, and I think there were a lot of similarities there. Elizabeth Bowen I look at quite a lot. I think this sort of like hallucinatory sort of atmosphere that Bowen starts to sort of bring into her work, especially around the Second World War, is really, there's a lot of correspondences with Kavan's writing there. Um, Lessing I look at quite a lot, although sort of we're moving into the latter part of the mid-century there. But I think again, Lessing was a big fan of Kavan's work, and I think there are a lot of overlaps there. So yeah, those are some examples. But I can say that I feel that almost anything that I read from that period, I get this sense of a sort of an instability in the understanding of reality, or a sort of a pressing at it, a sort of a questioning of it. Yeah, does that?
Yeah, and I guess with Kavan, I'm not as sure about the other authors there, but with Kavan especially, there is not a single iota of romanticism about this. At least that I saw. There isn't with. I mean, the other writers that come to mind when one thinks of perhaps heroin addiction would be someone like Burroughs, or yeah, as you say, with mental illness, often that can go into weird fiction or realms of wanting to play with what unreality is. But with Kavan, she somehow seems, at least, to keep you somewhere that is just deeply unpleasant, and there isn't really an avenue that you can go down to sort of explore in some romantic way, which sounds a bit coy, but there is just not even any element of that, and you have to just stay somewhere deeply unpleasant for the. And as you say, especially with Ice in the later work, you don't have a say, as you can't keep her at arm's length. You either are in the book or you're not. That's about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. And I think some people really, she's not to everyone's taste. Some people really don't enjoy that experience. It is very claustrophobic relationship with her, especially with her first person narrators. Yeah, easier with the third person work, but yeah, with the first person stuff, you're in there, as you say, whether you want to be or not.
Yeah, I think when I first approached it, I probably portrayed it with my question of a recurrent thread. Madness, as you said, madness probably is the best one, because that isn't really a thread, but I'm trying to bring to the text something of like, how can I control this? And then eventually on my like third reread or whatever, I was like, okay, I've just kind of got to let it happen and then see where I end up, which is equivalent to madness, I guess. But in what light does Kavan view mental illness? Is it so important to her? Is it doing something more? How does she see it?
Yeah, so again, there are some shifts throughout her fiction that, I mean, if you really want to sort of dig into her sort of political view on this stuff, her journalism is the place to go. So she publishes this article, I think in 43, called The Case of Bill Williams, which is really like, it's a really strong polemic against the category of mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting read, I think. And because her fictional writing is so hard to get a hold of, and because she is trying to strip out a lot of detail, it's hard to get a sort of a hard line of an argument or a definition of mental illness or madness there. She's deliberately making that hard to get a hold of. She's more trying to make you feel it than to understand her view on it, if that makes sense. And that's why The Case of Bill Williams is really interesting, because it's a very political argument about the category of mental illness, which is to say, she's basically saying, like, everyone's mad, nobody's mad. Madness is actually a form of political resistance. So that's, I mean, for that time, I think very interesting. Does that answer your question?
Did she co-write that? Was that with Binswanger or adjacent to Binswanger?
No, that was she co-wrote a book with her psychiatrist, Dr. Blutz. That was his tale later in the 40s, but her journalism was all her.
Ah,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a question that kind of haunts me, because and it's about like what holds power, because one thing with Kavan's fiction is that you're just powerless as a reader. The worlds are powerless, but at the same time, with psychiatric institution or dominating marriage or in ice, literally the ice walls, there is something in these worlds that has power, and the protagonist, or Kavan, is kind of pretty much helpless. And I wonder if you agree with me, what it is that Kavan sees as that which does actually have the power in these worlds, or in her world, I guess, also.
I mean, I think the weight of social conventionality to some extent, the expectation of some sort of social conformity. And you see that again, even in those early Helen Ferguson novels, which seem sort of, fairly bland in a lot of ways. The protagonists of those novels, they just don't fit in, basically. They don't quite fit in. And even though those novels are sort of romances, they go wrong. These protagonists are trying to sort of work through a conventional romance narrative, where they, grow up and, meet someone and get married. And it always just goes wrong. They're never quite what they should be. They're always a little bit misanthropic. People don't quite like them. They're not very comfortable. So I think that thing of power that you were describing, that constant oppressive force is social conventionality to some extent. It's something more than the British class system, but it's definitely tied up with it. It's a sort of an expectation of conformity, I would say, an expectation of what we might call sanity. Yeah. Do you think that? I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I think so, but it's difficult to. It's in a good way. It's strange to think about social convention as an oppressive force, but the notion of just not quite fitting in. Maybe that's what brings people to Kavan's fiction, is a sympathetic voice that doesn't romanticize the place they're in. Was Kavan always, even from her young years, perhaps always, I don't want to say anarchic, but, just not one for convention, or just didn't work? Is that always the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think she did describe herself as a very lonely child. She had a miserable childhood, was very alienated from her parents. Her father committed suicide. She was educated mostly in boarding schools. I think she felt miserable from an early age, and felt like a misfit from an early age. So yes, how much of that was a kind of a precursor to her later depression, I don't know. But I think, yes, she felt that she carried a lot of scars from her childhood forward. So it was obviously a pretty miserable time for her. Yeah.
And it feels like she never really had a home either. She traveled around a lot, I believe, when she was younger. So, I mean, would you describe her as a British writer?
Yeah, that's a funny one. I mean, British it has to be, but yes, she lived in a lot of different places. And I don't think she felt very aligned to the idea of Britishness. I think she was quite against it in a lot of ways. But she sort of has. If we're gonna categorize her in any way, then British it is. But yeah, she spent a couple of years in New Zealand, some time in the States, lived in Burma with her first husband. And in fact, in California as a child, her parents were there for a while. So she was sort of all over the place. And I don't think she felt very British. She certainly didn't feel as though she belonged in Britain. And so that would be my reason to kind of push back against that. Yeah.
Do you think her fiction feels British?
Interesting. No, not necessarily. I think there's probably a book for someone to write on how European her fiction is. I think there are some really strong parallels between her writing from the 1940s on and the Nouveau Roman. So I think there's definitely something quite European in a way going on there. And it's as well, the parallels you mentioned with Kafka are so strong. So I don't think it feels very British to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so the other question, I guess it's kind of related. It's the inverse of the power one, and it's the one you asked me to clarify. And maybe it's like, again, I'm just portraying Kavan in asking this because I'm sort of doing a very modern thing of wanting basically a happy ending or a happy place or something. But I do just wonder, like, is it just the case in a metafictional sense that the only home or sovereignty Kavan has isn't absolutely it's not anything to do with the content. It is just the fact she's able to write it at all. Like the book itself is the home, but like in Ice, there's not, and maybe again, maybe I am completely wrong in wanting this, but there is just not even the possibility of respite. And I mean, of course, that's just Ice, but an Asylum piece as well is because it's so open and fluxing. It's kind of like if everything is constantly shifting, then you don't really get a possibility of having a rest for a while.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that does vary quite considerably from book to book. And it's interesting, you're talking about Ice and Asylum Peace there, that those two do sit together. Like there is no resolution at the end of Asylum Peace. The final story is called I think that the penultimate story is called something like, oh, the end's approaching, or it's almost the end or something. And then the final story is called There Is No End. Which is, I guess that's me trying to sort of motion towards what you were saying. There is like, it's perpetual, this sort of like this difficult situation, this unresolvable situation. You're never going to have a sense that you're going to get there, even after the book has ended. Likewise in Ice, it's still going on. Like, you know, the story stops, but it hasn't stopped. It will still go on. It's just that you as the reader have dropped out of it by that point. But I do think, I was thinking about, you know, you're talking about the idea of home in her writing. There are places where there is a home, but it's pretty dark. So Sleep Has His House. I don't know if you know that one well. That's her most sort of explicitly surreal novel, where she's like, her writing becomes very, very sort of obviously influenced by psychoanalysis, by surrealist imagery. Again, your characters are sort of, you're not quite sure who they are, where they are. They're named by a single initial, but there is home is constantly referred to in that text. But home ultimately is sort of death by suicide. So that's a sort of that's a place where that character finds a sense of belonging, and that comes up in another one of her earlier novels as well. So is there a happy home? I guess no.
But maybe it doesn't need to be. I mean, very bleak statement. Maybe home doesn't need to be happy though. The feeling of home is, I guess, just one of at least a deep familiarity, which one could have with madness or suicide, I guess. But it just that sense of sovereignty of where maybe like finally get to put my feet down and say like, even if this is dreadful, at least I know in what sense there's like a control of the dreadfulness. But maybe that just doesn't even hold for Kavan, because, you know, the oppressive marriages are very much, I guess, ones of routine and a known horribleness. So yeah, maybe not.
So for me, with Asylum Peace, I love that we've talked loads about that one, because it's obviously both a favorite of both of ours. Is for me where the redemption is, and I think there is redemption there, and that's really the reason I love those stories, is that she captures in those stories the experience of depression, which I think is incredibly hard to put into words. It's an experience so far outside the normal of human existence, but she captures it in very few words. And the redemption for me is that somehow, and I don't know, I couldn't put my finger on how, somehow she makes it beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there's real beauty, especially in those late stories, and even those some of the middle ones that you were describing, where she's this character is in such despair, and yet the redemption is the beauty of the description. And I don't know how those two things weigh up. I don't know how she does that. And that's where the redemption is. And I guess if you're saying that, like, you know, where is that sovereignty in her writing? It's the fact that she can do that.
She can find beauty amidst that pain.
Yeah.
Do you think that holds for Ice as well?
No, I think complex than that. Ice is more disturbing than that, right? Isn't it? Because if we feel some empathy with the sort of unknown I narrator of Asylum Peace, we also have to feel some empathy with the unnamed I narrator of Ice. But who is he? You know, that's what's so awful about.
Did you feel empathy for him by the end?
You have to be him. You're reading as him. So that's why it's so disturbing, because I don't want to be, you know, a sexual predator. Like that, maybe a hero, maybe a villain, certainly a voyeur, certainly morally ambiguous and disturbing. And if you're going to read the book, as you were saying earlier, you have to be him. Like he is the I narrator. You have no access to anything except through his mind. And that's what I think is so disturbing about it. You can't get out of his head. And that's the power of it. So I don't know that there's anything redeeming about that, apart from the fact that it forces you to question your own moral position.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a comfortable read. It's not just a comfortable read about something bad that happens to people, and a hero and a villain, and you empathize with the good people. You empathize with the hero. You empathize with the victim. The bad guy is a bad guy. No, you have to be the bad guy. If, the way that she writes, you have to see things through his eyes. And I think maybe for me, the redeeming thing about that, and like you, I had to start it multiple times. And I didn't enjoy it at all the first few times I read it. But knowing more about her politics, I think, really helped me to get more out of the book itself. And I think that feeling of being disturbed is what she was aiming at.
Well, I'm wondering then, and it's adjacent to those politics, because those politics seem somewhat, probably about 20 years before, but they seem adjacent to the anti-psychiatry movement of Lang and then Foucault as well. So I wonder if there's a statement there of, if you want to understand this, you have to be in it. You can't be a psychiatrist outside of it looking in. Like, you have no option. Either you momentarily, even though that kind of makes no sense, but if you pick up ice momentarily, you have to be depressed. You have to embody it. Otherwise, you're not even there. But that in itself is kind of feels dangerous to pick up one of her books, because I remember finishing Ice and it was like, it's sunny outside, but I'm certainly not for the next few days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's hard work. It's hard work to read it. And some people, I think, enjoy being challenged more by their reading of fiction. And perhaps we all sometimes want to be challenged more and sometimes don't. But yeah. But I mean, there's also, I guess it might be worth just mentioning for anyone who hasn't read it, because we're making it sound really dark.
Like some sort of torture.
Yeah. Actually, there is a sort of playfulness as well there. And I think that doesn't get talked about when it comes to her writing at all. Like, everyone expects it to be like absolute earnestness and despair, but there's definitely some playfulness there as well. In Ice as well, she is being influenced, I would say, by spy fiction genre. So like, there's no way she hasn't been reading Ian Fleming. There is a sort of like a sort of gung-ho sort of playful atmosphere to it as well. I'm not sure that we're supposed to take it really seriously all of the time. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I think otherwise you get exhausted. And then I think that's why I had to restart it so many times, because I was, and I mean, this links to my next question. Admittedly, I think I was tackling it in an extremely, dare I say it, like a male way of like, right, I'm going to find the thing to hold on to and I'm going to figure this out. And you can't figure it out. So I'd get it and I'd have to restart. And eventually I sort of had to, in a very reasoned way, I was trying to rationalize it or something, or put it in its, like, put the pieces together. And they don't have any way to go together. And then you have to firstly you have to accept the ice is coming, whether you like it or not. You're out of control. You're this horrible person. You're doing awful things and you're in a horrible place. And that's, you either go with it or you don't. And then from that, something else arises.
Yeah, he's not all horrible as well. I guess that's the other thing that's worth, because, he doesn't think he is. He's the hero of the novel. He's going to save this girl. Why is he looking for her? To save her. He's going to protect her. He's an ambiguous character. We've got the big villain. That's the character of the warden. We know he's a bad guy. We've definitely seen him doing bad things. But, we, the protagonist, we think we're a good guy. He goes on all sorts of adventures. He sort of has these moments where he is a hero. He gets to be a hero for a while. But then what we see is that he's kind of enjoying watching her pain, and that, so he's more ambiguous, I think, than awful.
See, our differences here actually relate to my next question, which is something we've sort of tiptoed around, which is, a big theme and key area of Kavan's writing, which is that she's a a female writer and with female protagonists. And I don't know if you've read Melina by Ingeborg Bachmann. Okay, well, uh, a book that's kind of, I guess, adjacent. But in the introduction to that book by, I can't remember who wrote it, the introducer writes very bluntly, men will never be able to understand this in the way women do. They will just never fully be able to understand this in the way women do, which was the impression I got reading Melina. It's completely. But I wanted, I guess, somewhat of a controversial question. Possibly, can men fully understand Kavan? Or maybe not fully, but is the experience so different? Is there something in there that you think, yeah?
I think there are multiple ways like we can read Kavan from a feminist perspective. And I think there's definitely not consensus among female readers, especially over Ice. It's really interesting teaching it to students, actually. And some of the young women, they just can't stand it, and they can't believe that a woman would write that novel because of its depictions of sexual violence, which are not like horribly graphic, but they are disturbing, and they're disturbing because we're reading it through the eyes of somebody who's enjoying watching them. Just to be clear about that. So much talk about whether that work is feminist or anti-feminist. You can read it from different perspectives. She doesn't have much to say in her correspondence about sex, gender, feminism. The women's movement is kind of like building around her in the 1960s. She doesn't seem to have much to say about it. So she's not pressing consciously on ideas of gender, but I personally think it's everywhere throughout her writing. I don't know, can men understand women's experience in a patriarchal world? Well, let's hope so. If you're smart enough to engage with it, I think of course you can. So I would say there are really troubling aspects of her work, of Ice, basically, not of her work generally, but of Ice from a feminist perspective, because it does aestheticize violence towards women, which I think she's doing very deliberately, actually. And I think I have no problem with that from a feminist perspective. I think what she's doing is interesting, and it makes us think about it. Other women, I think, feel quite differently. So, yeah. Do you think that answers?
As there's little mention of gender or sex in her correspondence, do you think madness, as we mentioned it before, do you think that's that was so all-encompassing that it almost overcomes those distinctions?
I think the thing is with her is that identity is not, there is no identity. So political identity is not a thing in her way of thinking. She talks a lot in her correspondence in the 1940s about individualism. So she thinks everyone's an individual. She doesn't like, as I was saying, like social conformity, the sort of the being part of a crowd. For her, that leads to totalitarianism. Like these ideas that she's having are very much linked to the Second World War, to the fact that she's a pacifist. She doesn't like collective thought. She thinks that everyone is an individual. Every single person is a creative individual, and having to sort of fit into social conformity squashes that out of them. So when it comes to political identity, women's political identity as it begins to emerge, certainly in the second wave, she's just not really plugged into that. It doesn't make sense to her worldview. It's all about the individual person, and that's what the madness as an idea links to, is that if you as an individual really don't fit in, you're mad. And that's what she objects to.
Where does this all, I guess it's a bit of a trite question, where does it all end up? Where do you feel she, maybe not progress, but you feel there was a direction that she was heading towards, or was it more like a sort of sine wave where one book to the next you're not sure what sort of mood is going to arise or be there?
I think she was constantly playing with new things, being influenced by new things, and going back to old things and trying to make them new. So there's real sort of circularity actually in her writing. She comes comes back around to things, comes back to her Helen Ferguson writing years after she's changed her name, and kind of rewrites passages from that, turns it into a new book. So I think it's hard to see the progression of her writing in any sort of like linear, straightforward way. I think she's more and more, as her writing progresses, she's looking at return and repetition. I would say that would be my take on that.
Mm. Is there anything you'd like to add about Anna Kavan or your book? Do you feel is key that we haven't mentioned so far?
No, maybe I'll just say a bit more about repetition, because you mentioned, in your email you asked about her treatment of time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really interesting, and is something that does does change through her career. And just because I was talking about repetition, one thing again for people who might not have read Ice and be encountering it for the first time is that the whole thing just keeps rebooting. That's why it's really hard to read. You're like, hang on, didn't this already happen? Like, what's going on? Or that character's just dead, but now they're alive again. It's like it just keeps like resetting itself, and you're constantly not entirely certain whether the last thing you read was just a sort of fantasy in the mind of the narrator, or if it actually happened, or where you are. And that's definitely, when I'm thinking about her treatment of time, that's something that emerges very strongly across her 1960s writing. Who Are You, her 1963 novel, is kind of like in two parts. So you get a whole story, and then in the middle, there's kind of like a sort of schism, and you start again at the beginning, but it's all like just a little bit different. So again, you're a bit like, what goes on here? Like the ground's just shifted beneath your feet. And I think she uses the treatment of time to do that in quite interesting experimental ways. So yeah, just mention that.
Well, I mean, then there's, once you get rid of time, there isn't really a possibility. I mean, with Ice again, I think that was what threw me off, is once you can't do that, there's no ability for you to start to connect things or to reason things. You don't have any place to actually establish an identity or your identity as a reader, because you can't. Where am I putting myself? So it's sort of but this makes it all seem way looser than it somehow works when you read it.
Yeah. You just got to go with it, right? You've got to go with the flow. And it's all, again, coming back to some of what we've been saying about those feelings, reading something like a silent piece, of claustrophobia, those feelings of, she makes you as a reader kind of experience what she's describing. So if it's really hard to say, well, when you're terribly depressed, you feel like this, and this, and make it something that somebody who hasn't been terribly depressed understands, what she really does is she makes you feel it while you're reading it. So she makes you feel like time doesn't feel the same. She makes you feel like I have no connection to other people. She makes you feel that paranoia. You're constantly like, what's going on? Is there an enemy there? Is there not? So she makes you feel it. And that's I think I'm sort of losing the thread of this a bit, but that's the effect of her writing, is to make you kind of get it by experiencing it rather than just describing it. Did that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. Yeah. To the extent it can with Kavan.
Yes.
Yeah. Where would you advise people to begin with Kavan?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're into, really. Because again, she is really variable, and there are some people who love her earlier writing and hate Ice, and some people who are more into that. Ice is the big one. It's the one that you're probably more likely to meet someone if they've read it. If you're interested, you and I both love a silent piece, obviously, so that would be one. A lot of scholars really like Sleep Has His House. If you're interested in a more sort of stylistically modernist text, I would say, if you're quite into poetry, that's her most sort of poetic work. If you want to know more about her politics, read her journalism. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
So start.
Yeah, but one thing I did find when I started working on her was people were always like, "Oh, I'm going on holiday. Which Kavan?"
Don't take that
on the beach. Just like, yeah, don't do that.
I can't imagine.
It's not beach reading. It's not beach reading. Yeah.
No, I mean, Ice is. I mean, what 100 and I can't remember how. But it's the longest short book I've ever read. Yeah, just exhausting.
I feel like you kind of put yourself through it with that novel, so well done.
Well, I think it was that thing of there's something here, and I just leave it, and then I'll come back another time. But there was just some feeling that I was like, I can't. This is good, but for some reason I just can't right now. Like I just couldn't gel with it. I don't know what I was bringing to it.
Yeah.
But eventually, yeah, it was kind of haunting that I had to get through it at some point.
Would you say you enjoyed it?
Enjoyed, but enjoy. It's kind of like, I don't know, eating kale or eating your greens. You kind of have to. You have to do it. It's good nutrition.
Uh,
Enjoyment. I don't know. That's very coy. But enjoy is just such a like. It's just not a word I'd put near Kavan. But it's
yeah,
like I don't know. I enjoy like walking on the beach, which is so far removed from reading ice. But there is. I would say there is a positive feeling with it, which is like maybe like the feeling after finishing a marathon. I've never done that, but like someone sat down and finally like. So there is some
yeah.
positive experience there, I think.
It's worthwhile somewhere.
Oh, it's absolutely worth reading her. Yeah, absolutely. But it's not going to be the same. I mean, you mentioned Ian Fleming. It's not going to be like enjoyable in the sense of a spy thriller or this is a really fun book. But it's
Yeah,
difficult to sell something that is positive in a different qualitative sense.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Did you enjoy? Do you go back and reread Kavan now?
It's been a while since I've read her stuff, actually. But because I just lived and breathed her for so long. I mean, so long, and or everything, every pen to paper that she ever wrote over and over again. So in ways, it's kind of quite refreshing to move on a little bit, actually. So yeah, that's my honest answer to that. I don't go back and read her and read her and read her anymore. And I wouldn't even say she's, my favorite writer as for pleasure, as you said. I think she's a really important writer. I think she's a very interesting writer. But yeah, I'm not going to be reading her for fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we should mention the Anna Kavan Society.
Yes, you asked me about that at the beginning, and then I sort of I ambled off another direction. So as I said, when I first started working on her, there wasn't that much known about her. There have been 2 biographies. Some of what's in the biographies is just not that accurate, sort of mashup of sort of misremembered stuff from people who were interviewed, and there was just information that wasn't that available. So I sort of found myself in a world where a lot of what was circulating about her was apocryphal, not quite true or half true. So it seemed like a good idea to set something up that would firstly just be a place where the record was set straight in terms of the facts of her life and her bibliography, and sort of bring people together, because she had some really, really committed fans even back then. The people who were into her, really into her. She was really quite a cult writer. So it was nice to sort of just try and set up a forum where people who were either just into her work and wanted to find other people, or find out what was going on in the world of Anna Kavan, or people who wanted to do scholarly work on her, could kind of come together. And that's what the society was. In ways, I feel like she is so much better known now, it's almost not needed. I feel like, I don't go to academic conferences and say, I work on Anna Kavan, and have everyone turn around and go, and who, I kind of feel at some point it turned for me where I stopped going, oh, well, you'll have never have heard of her. And I just started making it sound like, oh, well, you haven't heard of her. So I think that's true. I think she is much better known now. That the Penguin edition of Ice that you were talking about, I think, real turning point. Yeah.
What do you think she'd think of your book?
I think she would be very pleased that someone was writing a book about her.
Okay.
I think she really craved recognition. There are many decades of her life where she really struggled to be published. She really believed in her own writing. And I think she'd be very pleased that she's getting the attention that she is now.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for the Kavan Society in your own book in the description below. But that seems like a good place to finish up. So, Victoria Walker, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, James. I hope that was okay.